So, Stewart, talk to us about how this builds out the options that people have already had on Slack and been making use of, especially over the last 18 months. What changes now?
Well, we're adding more tools, and I think it extends the capabilities of Slack, but also they take a step back and there's a broader ecosystem. So at Slack, we use Zoom, we also use Google Docs, and there's comments in those, and then you step further back and you look at all the tools that people are using. There's all of these different means of collaboration and communication, but we still haven't kind of reached every possibility, and we still end up using tools that really weren't intended for a specific use in a way that leads to burnout. So that was probably too complicated. But all the Zoom fatigue, I think, is because we're using a hammer on things that aren't nails, and we need more options. So the two things we launched, one, Huddles, the kind of ad hoc, unstructured, audio-only conversations, and the other one being video messages, are both there as alternatives, not total replacements, but alternatives to the grid of rectangles of video feeds of people's faces that we all got so used to.
How much did the pandemic specifically influence the development of a digital-first toolkit?
Enormously. I think one of the things we heard from customers was that people really needed a sense of belonging. There was not just that they miss their colleagues, but it's a very different experience to show up for work, and that just means you change rooms in your house and you don't get to see all the people. There's a lot of upsides, I think, for many people to not have to commute and to not have to travel so much for business, but they felt less connected. So one of the things you're trying to do was facilitate those kinds of connections and make people feel a greater sense of belonging. But also just the scheduling, I think, ends up being a really big problem. If I want to have a 2-minute conversation with you and we have desks that are a couple feet apart, I can just say, hey, Emily, ask you a question. We have a 2-minute conversation. It peters out. But if it's a meeting, it's next Tuesday from 11:30 to noon, and we end up using the whole 30 minutes. And so you have to wait a long time, and it uses a lot more of, reduces flexibility by an enormous amount. And
Right.
I think that causes a lot of stress.
Is Slack trying to kill the meeting, much like folks think of Slack as an email killer?
We're trying to kill some of the meetings. Now, people complain about meetings a lot. People also complain about email a lot. People complain about too many notifications. Ultimately, communication is hard, and it's kind of cognitively taxing, and it demands a lot of people. But I think those demands are really exacerbated if you don't have the right tool. So you imagine like a daily stand-up meeting where everyone goes around and they give a quick update on what they're working on. That doesn't have to be synchronous. It doesn't have to be at the same time. And if I record my update at 8:13 and listen to yours at 9:57, it gives us both this enormous sense of flexibility. It also means that there's only 3 minutes of content that was interesting to me in the meeting. I don't have to stay there for the whole half hour.
So, Microsoft, you voiced your concerns about Microsoft. You voiced your concerns about Microsoft to the EU. Microsoft just announced they're integrating Teams into Windows 11. How do you feel about that?
It seems like a pretty familiar pattern, going back over the last 20 years. I think ultimately, Instagram didn't have to be installed on people's iPhones in order for it to get a couple of billion users. So I'm not sure that the long-term impact will be as great as it was in the case of Internet Explorer, because that was just a different universe and people weren't aware of alternatives. But I think it is indicative of the kind of approach that they've taken to manufacture usage.
So is this anti-competitive? Should Congress be looking at this? Will you be complaining to the EU again, just like you have in the past about Teams and Office?
I'll leave that determination to the experts and the regulators. There's no plans for any kind of additional complaints, but I think it is great evidence for the tactics. That ultimately, it's not just about us and Microsoft. It's about the next generation of software, the next generation of innovation. And we've always tried to be the 1 or 2% of people's software budgets that are a multiplier on the value of the other 98 or 99% because of the degree of interoperability and the openness of the platform. I think where we want to make all software better, Microsoft just wants to be all of your software.
Well, so given the future and the evolution of software, obviously we're all waiting for Salesforce to complete its acquisition of Slack. I know you can't give us an exact date, but we're on pins and needles. Do you expect that Slack software will be integrated into Salesforce software, and how will the product evolve?
It's a great question. And I think what'll be really interesting is Slack supporting those use cases that are, in some cases, peripheral to Salesforce's software. And what I mean is there's updates that people make in Sales Cloud, the CRM system, but where the salesperson interacts with the lawyer or with the finance team or the accounting or security or product, that tends to happen outside in the system where communication happens. So in other words, in Slack. And integrating across those functions and kind of bringing the functionality of Sales Cloud or Service Cloud or Marketing Cloud into Slack and making it more widely accessible has a pretty profound impact. And there's 2,000 apps in the app directory, so it's true of many things. But I think you're going to see a much bigger emphasis on those kinds of integrations from across Salesforce.
Now, as you think about the future of work, and I know that Slack itself is taking a more flexible approach, we're also seeing companies as big as Apple and Amazon taking a more flexible approach, and then some companies like Goldman Sachs asking everyone to come back to the office. Do you think that some companies are getting this wrong? And how does that change the talent war in Silicon Valley that has always been so competitive? Now you have another thing to compete on.
Well, I think you almost answered the question. It's ultimately going to be a market-driven decision. I might want to say I have all these software engineering jobs to hire for, but I'm only going to pay $30,000 a year. I'm just not going to be able to hire people. Ultimately, the market, the employees, will tell us what they expect. And if you imagine there's two jobs and they're about equally interesting, the compensation is about the same, and one job requires that you're in the office 5 days a week, or even 3 days a week, and the other one gives you the flexibility to be there as often as is necessary or useful, who wouldn't take the optionality? I mean, like who wouldn't want at least the ability to move across the country if there's a family member with an illness, or to be able to spend part of the year in a different location. And it's not just that. We were just talking about this, but I have a 7-week-old now. I've been on paternity leave. I'm starting to come back, and I'm going to take a little bit more leave in the future. But it's going to be a very different experience than it would have been if I had an hour-long train commute, spent the whole day in the office, and then came back after the baby was already asleep. The opportunities that people have to have different kinds of relationships with their family, pursue other interests, and basically create flexibility that just wasn't possible before. I think that demand is going to be overwhelming, and ultimately the employees will tell us what they really want.